Welcome to the south of Scotland, where you can uncover the stories behind the stories. Some of Scotland's greatest literary figures drew their inspiration from the area's rich traditions, rolling hills and exciting history. Follow in the footsteps of John Buchan, author of the 39 Steps, by visiting his museum in Peebles or walking the John Buchan Way. Remember though, when it comes to spy fiction, you never know who the enemy is. Or take a leaf out of Walter Scott's book and be inspired by Traquair House, the oldest home in Scotland. Occupied for over 900 years and still lived in by Catherine Maxwell Stewart, the 21st Lady of Traquair. Every visitor has to pass through the side entrance though, with the famous bare gates locked tight. As Bonnie Prince Charlie and his Jacobite army marched south, the Laird of Traquair locked the gates behind them, only to be opened when a Stuart king sat on the throne again. And that's been 277 years now, and they're still waiting. The south of Scotland isn't just the borders though. Head across to Dumfries and you'll find the literary history just keeps going. A highlight in the town is Barrie, where J.M. Barrie played as a child and later labelled the birthplace of Neverland. The grand Georgian house has been extended and transformed into the national centre for children's literature, and it's nothing short of spectacular. However, if there's one famous writer that left his mark all over Dumfries, it's Scotland's national poet. Robert Burns might have been born and raised in Ayrshire, but when the time came for him to provide for his family, the poet took his plough to Dumfries. There was nothing here when he arrived to take possession of his plot at Ellisland Farm, and Burns constructed the farm buildings you can see today. He was already a famous poet, but art doesn't always pay, and he wanted to make an honest living without relying on rich patrons to fund his work. It was a tough life at Ellisland, but Burns softened the blow by making friends with Robert Riddle, who lived at Friars Carse, now a beautiful hotel nearby. There's a short walk through the fields and along the quiet banks of River Nith from Friars Carse to Ellisland, with an interesting wee stop halfway. During Burns' visits to his friend, the poet would often sit and write in a little folly on this spot called Hermitage, the perfect place for inspiration. Whatever Robert Burns did while staying at Ellisland, it worked. During his time here, he wrote some of his most famous pieces, such as Auld Lang Syne or the epic poem Tam O'Shanter. The farm has barely changed since those days, and a visit to Ellisland means that you're looking at a scene Burns would immediately recognise. Sadly, farming wasn't bringing in enough to support his ever-growing family, and Burns had to take on an extra job as an excise officer, essentially a taxman. That forced him to ride up to 200 miles a week until a promotion gave the family an opportunity for an easier life in Dumfries itself. Walk these streets, following in the footsteps of Burns, and it's immediately obvious the massive impact the poet had on the city. His house became a shrine to his legacy. The Robert Burns Centre sits on the banks of the Nith, and his mausoleum shines in white in St Michael's graveyard. It's a far cry from his original burial, hidden away in a back corner before being moved a whole 21 years after his death. Lastly, the highlight of any Robert Burns pilgrimage to Dumfries has to be the Globe Inn. This was the poet's favourite drinking spot, and aside from filling up with some especially fine dining, you can take a tour to see something pretty special. There's poetry that Burns scratched into some upstairs windows with his diamond stylus, and that's in the room he sometimes shared with the landlady's niece. But even that pales in comparison to the chance to sit in the poet's special chair. Although be warned, you'll either have to recite some of Burns' work or buy a round for the whole pub. And like a true Scotsman, I never buy a round if I can help it.